Good afternoon, everyone joining us live. Good evening or good morning for those of you watching the recording. Welcome to Automation Hour. We'll get started with just a few logistic slides. So we do have all lines muted. However, you can absolutely post your questions either in our Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community group or here in the GoToMeeting chat or the questions widget, and we will be monitoring those and we'll make sure that all your questions get answered. We are also recording this session and it will be posted to YouTube, and if you registered, which you did since you're here, you will also get a link to that recording after the fact. We absolutely invite you to join our community group on the Trailblazer community. Also keep an eye on our website, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Automation Hour is our handle there. So this is our last session for the year. We are actively working to finalize the schedule for 2022, and I expect that to be posted probably early to mid next week. Cannot wait. We've got a banner lineup of presenters coming. We just need to finalize a few things there. So as always, we want to thank our sponsors. We could not bring this to you without their help and support. First off, ActiveCampaign, who definitely helps us with promoting and getting the word out to the community about all these amazing webinars. And of course, our other sponsor is Concrete.io, who has been with us since the beginning, and we very much appreciate all that they've done to help us. All right, so as you all know, the amazing three who founded the Automation Hour series, David Litton, Jen Lee, and Rakesh Gupta, about 5 or 6 years ago now, we've gone through a few changes as career paths have taken some different trajectories, and so now the current co-hosts are Rakesh Gupta, who is unfortunately unable to join us, but he's on vacation, so I'm sure he's having a banner time, and of course, me, Michelle Hansen. So with that, we will turn it over to our presenter for the day, Ohad Idan. Ohad, take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and turn on my video, and let's see if that will work. Great. So you should all be able to see me. It's a pleasure to be here again. So to those of you who don't know me, I am the founder and CEO of Praxis Solutions. We're a Salesforce consulting organization. I've been a Salesforce MVP for the last 5 years. I have 15 certifications. I live now in Richmond, Virginia, and I co-lead the developer user group here, together with my partner in crime, John Daniel. I presented in a bunch of different places. My Twitter handler is right there below in case you ever want to reach out to me. I love hearing from everybody and I love answering questions. My start with Salesforce was accidental admin in 2010. And if you've ever heard me talk before I've said it, the way that I started was with my boss calling me and asking me one day, "Hey, Ohad, have you ever heard of Salesforce?" And I said, "Nope, what is it?" And his answer was, "I don't know, but it's now your problem." And 11 years later, I'm here right now, having tons of fun working with Salesforce. Okay, so that's me. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to cover a couple of, or really 3 separate topics. I figured we'll talk about stuff that admins should really know. Those are all things that you may know something about, and my hope is that even if you're familiar with the topics, you may leave today with something new that you did not know. So we'll look at some information about record ID. It's something that we maybe take for granted as we work with Salesforce every single day. But we'll take a look a little bit under the hood and talk about what makes a record ID. We'll talk about this field called external ID and what we can do with them and how they can be useful to us. And then we'll talk about the execution context, and we'll continue that with how we can use platform events to break the execution context. So with all that, let's just get started. So we all know that the record ID in Salesforce is either 15 or 18 characters. Some of you may know what the difference between is, and some of you may not. But when you look at a record ID, you can really kind of break it down into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate sections. And the first three characters are what we call the key prefix. And we'll talk about the key prefix in a second. The next two characters, are the instance. And in essence, this has a record of which instance your record was created on. Are you on NA40, NA75, and so on? Each one of them has a different value assigned to it. However, just by looking at this number, you can't really know anything about what this value is. Also, if your org was created on one instance and then migrated into a different instance, you might end up with records in your org that have different values for those two different characters. Beyond that, there's one more character that's reserved. That just means that there's no current use for it. However, there may be a future use for it. And then finally, or not finally, but the next 9 characters are a unique identifier. And that's basically almost like a counter that has a unique number for each record in a specific object. The last 3 characters, that's what makes the difference between the 15 and the 18 character record ID, are what we call the case insensitivity checksum. And what that means is there's a value here that allows us to ensure that regardless of whether letters here are uppercase or lowercase, we get a unique combination of characters when we look at this entire 18 characters. And we'll also talk about that in more details in a minute. So I'm not seeing any questions, but feel free to ask any questions if anything pops up. Let's talk about what the key prefix is, right? So those first 3 characters of every record is what we call the key prefix. Every single record in your environment will start with the 3 characters that represent what this record belongs to. So if you look at any record that starts with 001, will always be a count. Every record that starts with 005, for example, will always be a user. 005 or 500, I'm sorry, 500. And so by knowing what those first 3 characters are, we can actually know what this record ID references. And when you look at standard objects in your environment, they would always have the same key prefix no matter what org you're in. Sandbox, production, customer A, customer B will always have the same key prefixes. That's why I can say 001 is an account, 006 is an opportunity, and so on. However, with custom objects and any custom metadata that you create, they are unique. And that includes any packages that you install. What that means is that if I take a package and install it in my org, and it has a custom object in it, the key prefix that I get for any given object will potentially be different than anybody here that installs in the same package in their org. There are a couple of caveats here. So let's say that I installed a package in my sandbox environment, and again, each object gets its own key prefix. And then I go ahead and install it, the same package, in my production. It doesn't even have to be a package. Let's say that I create an object in my sandbox, and then I deploy using change set or using any of the deployment tools that are out there, deploy that object into my production. There's no guarantee that the object will have the same prefix between those two environments. However, if you create an object and it makes its way into your production, any sandbox that you create from that production environment, or if you use the clone sandbox, if you create a sandbox from another sandbox, they will always have the same key prefixes in the cloned environment as they were in the original environment. And just in case you want to memorize all of the standard prefixes, it's really not a problem. We have a gentleman by the name of Daniel Bellinger, who used to be a Salesforce MVP and now works for Salesforce, who kept a good track of all the standard objects. And if we open this little list, you can see it's just a short list with prefixes. Many of them may not even make sense to you, but as you can see, it's a pretty freaking long list.
Yeah, they actually reference this website in the official Salesforce help article on this.
Yep, absolutely. So as you can see, account is 001, contact is 003. I was right at first. User is 5, opportunity is 6, and so on. There's definitely value in my mind in knowing some of the key ones, especially the ones that you work with frequently, because again, just by looking at the record ID, you can know what you're dealing with. And as an admin, if you have to deal with user errors, if you have to deal with flows that fail, flow failure emails, stuff like that, just looking at the record ID and knowing immediately kind of what you're looking at, it can be really helpful and save you a bunch of time. The other thing is, again, if you work in a single org, if you work in a company, you might learn, once you start looking at the key prefixes, you might kind of learn and memorize what some object key prefixes are in your org. It's a little different when you're a consultant like me and I work in different environments every day. There's no value for me to memorize anything other than standard. It's really not possible, I would argue. Are there any questions so far? I see that you posted some articles. Thank you.
I think so far we are doing good.
Good, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the checksum that we talked about, the last 3 characters, the thing that makes a record ID be 18 characters instead of 15 characters. So here we see that you have 2 record IDs. They look exactly, almost identical. The only difference is that one has a lowercase x, one has an uppercase x. And what you can see is that the checksum, those last 3 characters, are different because of that uppercase character. No matter which character inside your record ID will be a different case, these 3 characters will always end up generating a different value. Why is this important? Well, one of the places that it's really important is when we export Salesforce record IDs to Excel. It's extremely plausible, and in fact, I've encountered many times scenarios where you have 2 separate records that actually have the same string, but with different cases. If you use something like VLOOKUP, doesn't matter if you VLOOKUP the uppercase or the lowercase, VLOOKUP is case insensitive. That means that when you look up either one of those from one list in another list, it will just find always the first one that's in that other list. And what that means is that you might end up creating associations or updating the wrong records many times. In fact, my very first Salesforce data load job in 2010, I had screwed up exactly in this way. I've done VLOOKUP. I did not know this about Salesforce record IDs at the time, and I ended up updating a bunch of records multiple times and making a big mess out of my data. And it took me many days after that to fix all that mess. So by making sure that you work with your 18-character record IDs, you can ensure that no matter what you do, the string will be different as long as one of those first 15 characters is different than other records. And so it's actually a really interesting thing. If you care about these kind of things and you want to dive a little bit deeper, there's a nice Stack Exchange post that explains everything I just talked about record IDs, even a little bit more in depth, but also talks about how to calculate the checksum, how the checksum is calculated. So if we look at this little article, there's a really simple explanation of the algorithm explaining how Salesforce calculate the last 3 characters from the first 15 characters. And furthermore, if you go into the second link that I have here, there's a simple Apex class that allows you to do that inside Salesforce. So there's a little Visualforce page, or you can run this in Developer Console directly, and you can calculate your own checksum. So to those of you who care about understanding this a little bit more in depth, those are really valuable resources. Okay, so why do I care about all these things? Well, the third thing is maybe the first, should have been the first really, and that is really just gaining a little bit deeper understanding and understanding how the platform works, right? And the more you know, the more you are able to do things. And again, there's a lot more behind the scene to know even about the, what I've already spoken of. The next one is actually what I already described, right? So when you look at error messages from your users, or when you are looking at flow errors, or get an email with a link, you can recognize immediately what object is the issue or what object you're being linked to. And that's just, I find it's useful, as a consultant. Many times an email will come in from a customer and will tell me, we got this error with a flow, and the error message references a record ID. And I can say, okay, that's the account object. I know where to look right away, right? And another thing is it actually allows you to navigate to an object's homepage. So you may or may not know that, but if you're going to Salesforce and after the .com, put a / and 001, guess what? Salesforce will take me to the account's homepage. The same thing with any one of the other prefixes. So you can get really to any object in your org without having to go through tabs, by just knowing the prefix. So again, just something that I over the years have found extremely useful and makes my life easier. So at this point, I would like to pause and ask if there are any questions about this topic, because we are going to jump into a different topic.
Indeed, we do, Ohad. So,
wonderful.
Ellie, I hope I pronounced that right, wants to know, so to be on the safe side, we should always use the 18-digit ID. Is there ever a case when we need to use the 15-digit ID?
So the short answer is yes. Always use the 18 characters IDs if you can. There's really no quote unquote harm in using 18 characters, especially when you export out of Salesforce and interact with it in external systems. 18 characters will always be safer. There's never a scenario where you are required to provide a 15 character ID. Salesforce will always accept either 15 or 18. So again, whenever you interact with it outside of Salesforce, I see no reason to not use the 18 characters.
I think I have run across one place where it forced me to use the 15-digit ID, and I cannot remember now where it was, but it was in like a validation rule or something, which I know it's terrible, don't do that. But I think it was either process builder or something like that. So if you weren't familiar with using like a custom label or custom setting or custom metadata to kind of do that, there's very small use cases for 15.
There are a couple of cases where, depending on where in Salesforce you get a record ID and how you get it, you may get the 15 or you may get the 18 character record ID. And what I've found in the past is in process builders or flows, when you compare, you have to, when you do like if this ID equals that ID, you have to make sure that you're looking at the same length record ID, because I've actually done it one time, and in one place I was getting the 15 and one the 18, and it was never matching, even though it's the same record ID. So I had to either use the formula case safe ID, which always, if you use case safe ID and open parentheses and pass in a record ID, Salesforce will return the 18 character ID. So I had to either use the case safe ID on one side to make sure I get the 18 character version of it, or truncate the 18 characters to 15 so that the comparison will be correct and will be successful, and my flow would work as expected. Awesome. Any other questions?
Let's see. Robert chimed in with wow. Did not know that. Very useful. Thank you.
Awesome.
And so then Ruth, I think, was chiming in as well. There was a place, it was either process builder or workflow rule or somewhere that you had to use that 15. Phil also noted that I think Pardot used the 15 for dynamic rules.
Okay.
So there may be some 15 use cases, but yeah, 18 when you can, right?
Yeah, I will be candid. Pardot is not my specialty, so I can't speak to that. But yes, unless you need to use the 15, which there may be very, very few scenarios, you should use the 18. And again, especially when you are exporting data out of Salesforce, there's no reason you should ever use the 15, because of the risk of system not being case sensitive, right? So try to always use the 18 if you can. Awesome. Anything else, Michelle?
So far we are good. I think we can move on to the next.
Awesome. So we're going to take this whole idea, put it aside, and we're going to jump into a completely different topic. So external IDs. And I put here a data loader's secret tool, right? External IDs are one of those things that when I speak to junior admins, they're familiar this thing exists, but they don't really know why they should care. And so by the book, if you go and read the documentation, the purpose of an external ID field is to represent an ID, an identifier for a record inside Salesforce from a separate external system. So let's say you have a Salesforce CRM integrated with an ERP system that's outside of the platform. And whenever a customer is created in the CRM, you want to push them to the ERP so orders can be created. Well, when you create the customer in the ERP, you might get the ERP ID and store it in Salesforce on a field called ERP customer ID. And you would mark that field as an external ID field. And by itself, that sounds like, okay, great. So now I know this is an external ID. I know this references an external system. So what, right? However, the reason that external IDs exist is that now that external system can come to Salesforce and ask to get that record, update it, or relate to it from another records without knowing the record ID. Instead, you can reference that external ID as the replacement to the record ID. So what that means is you can update the record without knowing the actual record ID, as long as you know the external ID. You can relate a child to a parent without knowing the parent record ID, but only its external ID. And you can have a predictable environment agnostic identifier for a record. And what I mean by that is that if you're data loading into a sandbox to do a test, and then you need to data load into production, you can know that those records, excuse me, you can identify those records easily. Now, again, you may ask, so what? Why do I need to know that the same record exists in the sandbox and in my production environment? And to be clear, I'm saying that we don't even need to care about external system to use external IDs. We have use cases we can use external IDs that have nothing to do with external system, that just help us do data loading. So let's look at a use case. I just received from my marketing department or from my sales department a bunch of Excel files that have accounts, contacts, opportunities, and cases. Maybe we're migrating from another system, CRM system, into Salesforce. And I need to load accounts, contacts, opportunities, and cases. Well, how would you normally do that? Well, first thing you need to do is load the accounts. And once you load the accounts, you would take those account IDs that you created, you'd probably copy them into a sheet in your Excel file, and then you would use something like VLOOKUP to say, okay, this account ID is the parent for these contacts based on the account name that I had in my account load file. Then after I loaded my contacts, I would have to copy the inserted contacts record IDs back and do the same thing to populate the contacts and the accounts on the opportunities and then on the cases, right? So you would, again, just need to do a bunch of different things just to be able to insert a bunch of related things, because naturally there's no way for you to relate the contact to an account. Now, this is an example with 4 related objects. I can tell you again, in my life as a consultant, I've had data loads that had dozens in multiple of records that needed to be related to each other. And that means that sometimes I need to load a data set into production, and then I need to take the same data set and load it into a sandbox. And then after it's been validated and tested and whatever, I need to take the same or similar data set and load it into my production environment. And if I had to do these steps for every one of my 24 objects, I would be a very unhappy person at the end of the day. So how can we use an external ID to accomplish the same thing? When using an external ID, these 8 steps now become 4 steps. I can load my accounts and give them external ID values. I can load my contacts and use external IDs. We'll actually look at that in 1 second. And then I can load my opportunities and cases. I don't have to do any export or any getting the results and using any VLOOKUPs or anything like that. So at this point, if you've seen this, you're saying, yeah, I know this is a great tool. I don't believe some people don't know about it. But if you don't know, let's look at how we actually do this. Let's get our hands a little dirty here and look at how something like this will be done. So I created 3 mock files, accounts, cases, and contacts. I skipped opportunities because really it's the same as contacts, but let's take a look at what I have in my account CSV file. For now, I have exactly 2 values, an account name and an external ID. Now, in my case, I used the external ID just as a sequential number. You may have other things that are more natural to use as external IDs, something that actually identifies the account and is unique enough that we know that other accounts will not have the same external ID. What I've also done is I've gone to my account object and I've created a field called external ID. I created an external ID field and I made sure I check these 2 checkboxes. One is external ID and the other one, make it a unique field. And the reason it's important for me to make the external ID unique field, it's not required, by the way. You can have an external ID field that is not unique. In our use case, we want to make it unique because we want to make sure that when I reference an account by its external ID, so if we look at this account, if I want to say I want to reference this account and I say 1, but there's 2 of them that have an external ID of 1, Salesforce doesn't know which one I'm referring to, and it will say, hey, there's multiple, you have to be more specific. Okay, I've also done the same thing. I'm sorry, I thought I had it open, but I guess I might have navigated away. I've done the same thing on the contact object. And I've created the same exact field, external ID. It's unique and it's an external ID field. And by the way, if you don't have the practice of always putting a description in a help text, you need to start. It's always good to have an explanation of why you created a field. And sometimes it may be the same as the help text and sometimes it may not. But many times it will be useful to you and in many other cases to others in your organization. So now that I've created these 2 fields, obviously I can now load this account. And really here, there's nothing special about this, right? I'm just going to load the file into Salesforce. So let's do an insert and select the account object. 1 second. And select our account CSV file, click next. There's 20 accounts in here. I'm gonna automatically map them because we only have account name and external ID. Any questions before I click next? Too late. Okay. Well, my session timed out, so I will need to relog in.
Well, while you're doing that, we did have a few things come in over chat. So
Okay.
thanks to Ksenia, we have a couple more links to share in chat on converting via a formula, and then an online conversion tool for that 15 to 18 digit. Ruth also wanted to chime in, which I think you covered, that integration tools is a hugely great use case for using external IDs, so you don't need the Salesforce generated ones.
Absolutely.
And from my personal painful experience, CPQ, if you are using CPQ, all the configuration is done in data record, not in metadata, and not having external IDs is going to set you back a few days.
Yeah, many days. I've had to do a CPQ migration, and without external IDs, I would have probably cut a finger off or something.
Yep.
More.
In that case, absolutely include one more checkbox there on your external ID field called required, Michelle. It's required that you fill this out.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously in this case, I did not want to make it, but you absolutely could make it required if you don't want to create a record without a record ID. I would even go a step further, and in many cases, we've created a process that populates the external ID automatically using a flow or a trigger on every record based on some parameters that we know are going to be reliable and consistent and always populated.
Which that dovetails nicely into Lakeisha's question is the external ID automatically attached to every account, contact, and opportunity? If so, how is that accomplished? And so I
So
think you just answered her
yeah, I
question.
mean, it's a field, right? I mean, it doesn't automatically get populated. You have to populate it either manually using a data load or with some process automation, right? So hopefully that answers your question. So right now we inserted those 20 accounts, no problem. I can view my successes. Here's all the record IDs, but I don't care because I have my external IDs. So let's click OK. And let's go ahead and look at my contact CSV file. So here's my mock contact file. Come on. Okay. So here we have our first name, our last name, an email. I have an external ID for the contact, but look at this. I have account.external ID. And now I can actually reference the account external ID right here. So this guy belongs to account 19, which happens to be this guy, ThoughtBridge. And so again, without having to know my record IDs, I'm able to relate this account, this contact to that account. So let's try and see if that works. Now, when you want to reference relationships through external IDs, you have to use the upsert type of data load, not an insert. So I'm going to select upsert. We're going to select contact. I'm sorry, this org has a lot of objects. And select my contact CSV. When I select upsert, you'll notice the first thing it's asking me is how are you matching these contacts to existing contacts? Because as you may know, upsert means you're either creating or updating records. I can say the external ID field is how I match. Now, none of these will exist because I don't have any of those external IDs right now in my system. However, if these external IDs were something that's reliable and that actually has a meaning, maybe the email address is actually the external ID. You can absolutely do that. Then if any of these contacts existed, this upsert would have caused an update rather than creating a duplicate. Okay, so I'm going to select the external ID. And now this is another thing. It's asking me the account relationship. Do you want to use any external IDs rather than the record ID to establish this? And we say yes. We're going to, on the account, there's actually on my account object, there's 3 fields that are external IDs. But we're going to use this external ID field that we just populated. And I'm going to ignore the other 2. And again, we'll create the auto match. So you'll notice it auto matched these 4. And I intentionally named it in a way that wouldn't auto match. But you can see that on my fields at the top, I have the account ID, which if I drag this, it would expect the actual record ID of the account object. However, we also have account : external ID _ C. And when I drag this here, it basically tells me now I am identifying the relationship instead of by the account ID, by the account external ID. So we'll go ahead and click next and upload this. If we're lucky, all 180 contacts will be inserted successfully. Look at that. And of course, we have 180 record IDs, but I don't care because I have external IDs. And finally, we can look at the last file. Very similar, we have cases. And here we have a case description, a contact external ID, and an account external ID. So now I can say, I'm looking at this contact from this account. I will give you, being candid, I did not make sure that those actually match. So I randomized these numbers and these numbers. So there may be that this contact doesn't belong to this account. However, that doesn't matter because Salesforce allows us to select a contact that doesn't belong to the account. by default. So let's try, and we'll use the upsert again. This time we'll select cases. We'll select our case file. There's 180 cases. We're going to match on the ID, even though we don't have an ID column at all. So that means everything is an insert. And we're going to match to the account using the external ID, and we're going to match to the contact using external ID. I'm going to ignore the other ones. Now, these external ID fields appear to be the same, but of course, this is the external ID field on the account object, and this is the external ID field on the contact object. And so we'll do the same thing. We have our, actually, I'm sorry, it's subject, not description. So I'll match description to subject, and then account external ID to account external ID, and contact external ID to contact. And successfully inserted. So if we go here and we look at our recently viewed accounts, let's look at all accounts. Here's some of the accounts we created today. Here's Thought Bridge that we looked at. And Thought Bridge has a bunch of cases we created today and a bunch of contacts we created today. So, any questions?
Yes, so Ellie wanted to know, if you make an external ID field required, would that cause any issues for integrations pushing in accounts, contacts, or opportunities, for example?
Yes, the short answer. I mean, that just means that you will not be able to create any account without an external ID, right? So if you make it required, but you have an integration pushing new accounts without an external ID, then that insert will fail, right? So you need to really be considerate of, where is data coming into Salesforce? How is that external ID being populated? Are you expecting users to type in that external ID when they create accounts on the system? My recommendation actually would be to use some kind of a process automation, right? A flow that assigns an external ID. There's a couple of different ways to handle something like this. You can create an auto number field. An auto number field cannot be an external ID. So you'd create an auto number field, and then you'd create a process builder that overflow that copies that auto number field to an external ID field, for example. In some other scenarios, you might have things that more naturally make sense to have as an external ID, like maybe for contact, it's the email. Maybe for a company, let's say you're only dealing with public companies, maybe it's the stock symbol, right? Something that's more natural, but will also be unique, right? I have a lot of other examples, but I don't want to get too deep into this.
Absolutely. And then Robert also commented, I had no idea about using external ID for this, would have saved me a lot of time a year ago with a migration.
Well, so. I promise you there will be another migration, Robert. There's always another migration. Okay, unless you retire next week, I don't know. Maybe there's something I don't know. Anything else?
We are good for now.
Awesome. So for our next topic, we're going to talk about our execution context. So raise of hands, who here knows what the execution context is? You don't really need to raise hands. You can if you want. I mean, especially if you're home in front of whatever. So what is the execution context? I came up with this saying above, everything that happens when something happens, right? Extremely descriptive. However, the execution context starts when a call is made to the Salesforce server. What is that call? It can be a call to insert a record. It could be or multiple records, like our data load right now created 20 accounts in a single execution context. The same with update, delete, or undelete records. When you send a request to the server to execute Apex, that will also start the context. A Visual Force or a Lightning page loading will start an execution context. And everything that happens from the moment the context starts until, well, when it ends, really, when all the operations are sequentially completed, is what we call the execution context. And the things that happen between the start and the end is what we call the order of execution. So you might have seen this document if you have been an admin for any meaningful amount of time and you have not seen this document. Shame on you. You should have seen it millions of times. But really, there's a handful of things, and by that I mean more than a handful, that happens every time you try to update a record, for example, right? And all these things are what we call the execution context. And some things may actually call you back to a higher level, and they all happen sequentially. And when they're all done, your execution context is done. So everything that happens between the start and the end of the execution context is what we call synchronously. We execute it at the same time, one after another, right? And this is a really important topic, really important concept, understanding what happens synchronously. So why would there ever be a scenario where you want to kind of break out of your execution context? Well, some things cannot be done within a single execution context. There's a scenario where you want to do what we call mixed operations, right? If you want to update a record, for example, a case, and a contact at the same time, sorry, the user at the same time, you're not allowed to do both of these updates in a single context. You will get an error saying mixed operation DML, mixed DML operations. You can't, we actually had a scenario very, very recently here at Praxis where we had a community where something was happening on the community. We needed to update the contact for the user that is in the community, and at the same time update the user as well. And you cannot do both of these updates in a single context. So you need to break out of the context. Also, call outs to external systems. If there's a trigger, you're not allowed to call out, to do a web call out in a trigger context. So you might need to break out of that context. And finally, one of the main reasons that I find myself having to break context is the dreaded governor limits, right? Too many SOQLs, too many DMLs, CPU timeout. Those are all things that tell you you're trying to do too much of something in a single execution context. Now, I want to caution you, just because you get a too many DML or too many SOQL doesn't mean that the solution is to find a way to break out of the execution context. Sometimes it means you have an inefficient piece of automation, a flow that has a create record inside a loop could immediately cause you to have too many DMLs. A flow that has get records inside a loop will have too many SOQLs very easily. In the same way, even CPU timeout can be caused by inefficient code or inefficient flows. So always think about, is my thing that is working here is actually working efficiently? That's the first thing you should be looking at. But if you know that you've done everything you can, and it's not governor limits, or it's not governor limits, there's an actual other reason why you have to be in a different execution context, you need to find a way to break out of that execution context and start a new execution context. Now, everything that happens in a different execution context, in one that is separate from the execution context that started it, is said to execute asynchronously, as in not at the same time. So if I have a process that starts, I save the record, and it starts a separate context, that context is asynchronous. And what that means is there's no guarantee that the other new context will complete before my first one will complete. In fact, most of the times, it's almost guaranteed that your new context will complete after your initiating context. Okay, I use the word context a lot. In this context, does everybody have any questions before I go forward?
Let's see, Phil's comments. CPU timeouts? No.
Okay, fair enough.
Ellie,
It's not a question, but I like it.
Ellie said, when you say update the contact and user in a single execution context, 2 or more objects, are you saying updating these via automation?
Yes. So, excuse me, whether it's a flow, a process builder, or a trigger, if you try to update a contact and then try to update a user, you will get a mixed DML operations error, because you're not allowed to update a user, which is, user is kind of this weird between a record and metadata, but it's considered metadata, and you're not allowed to update them in the same transaction. So I dare you to try that. Go today, create a flow that tries to update a contact and then tries to update a user, and you'll get this wonderful error. There's a bunch of other things that are considered mixed operation. You can't update any data, be it account, contact, opportunity, case, whatever data, and user group membership. So you can't assign a user to a group. And there's a handful of other things that would cause these mixed DML operations. And there's very real use cases for why these sometimes need to happen at the same time or as a result of a single thing that happens. In fact, I have a Dreamforce talk that I can share a link at the end that goes into a much more depth into this specific scenario. Any other questions?
Nope, we have them all answered for now. Keep going.
Wonderful. So just to kind of explain visually the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. So when you have update a contact and you have a trigger and you have a workflow and you have a flow and you have a validation rule, all of these things happen as per our order of execution in a single line. Oopsie, and you see I already revealed my next thing, but they happen in a single line, right? User clicks save on a record, everything in that document gets executed, and then the page reloads, the execution content ended. Another, by the way, another name for the execution context is the transaction. The transaction ended. However, if you want to create anything asynchronous, sometime here, maybe your workflow starts an asynchronous process, and that gets started anywhere from right away or sometimes a while away. So you get it set up, you ask Salesforce to start it. It can start anywhere from seconds to minutes later, and finally it completes, and there's no guarantee that this will complete after or before. There's really no way for you to control that. So just another visual way of thinking about synchronous versus asynchronous operations. So how do we break our execution context? There's a handful of ways for us to do that. The first one is what we call future methods. That's an apex, a code way to break your context. And by the way, in the same way as future, I didn't write it here, I should have. If you use a scheduled path on a flow or a scheduled action on a process builder, you break out of your context. You essentially schedule something to happen after your execution context ends, and by definition, that will have its own execution context. So future methods are one way, queueables are another way, batch classes are another way, and finally, platform events also allow you to break your execution context. So what I want to look at is platform events specifically. So to those of you who don't know what platform events are defined in your setup. And right here, you go to platform events, and you can create your own platform event. We look at the one I just created here. And platform event looks many ways kind of like an object. You can create some fields on it, but not the same set of fields. You can have a lookup, you can have some other types of fields. You can create some fields on it. And at that point, you'll notice that the platform event API name always ends in __E for event. What do you do with a platform event? Well, platform events are not like records. You cannot ever delete a platform event once it's been published, and you can't quite read them in the same way that you read a record, like a case or whatever. The idea with platform events is you publish an event, which is almost identical to creating a record, and you have things that listen to these events. You have something that is a subscriber to that event. And once that event is published, the subscriber can take action. The subscriber can be a trigger, it can be a process builder, or it can be a flow. It can even be an external system using a technology called Comet-D. I'm not going to go into more details. There's a lot more to say, and I have a talk about that as well that I'm happy to share the link to later. However, the idea here is that when you publish an event, the trigger that executes as a result of that event execute in a separate context. And that's why it's a way for us to break out of context. If you have a context and something happens, you publish your event, and whatever happens needs to happen after that will happen in its own context. It's a trick that I use very, very frequently for different reasons. So we have a flow that I created here. This flow is really, really simple, and it allows me to create an account. Okay, it has one screen, account name, address, and external ID, and it has a create account element that just maps those to the account and inserts the record. If we try this, if I go to my homepage, I embedded this flow in my homepage, and I can easily Ohad's test account, and I can even put an address, 123 Main Street. That's of course in Gotham, whatever, New Jersey, why not? 123456, 12345, and the country is USA. And my external ID is Ohad. Create account. Oh, there was an unhandled fault. Something wrong happened here. And look at that, I even got an error message that tells me there was a flow error. And specifically, it tells me that there's a missing field required. Name, I guess I mismapped it. Let me see what happened here. Oh, look at that, I forgot to count name, map to here. This is what happened when you only do positive testing. You only test your flow for what you expect to happen. So again, Ohad's test account. I'm going to skip the address right now, Ohad external ID, and try to insert it. And guess what? I was able to insert it. If I go to my accounts, there's now Ohad's test account. However, what happens if I try to insert Ohad's second test account and I put an external ID of Ohad? Well, something went wrong and I don't know what. So the first tip I have for you here is always have, everywhere you have a DML or SOQL, make sure you create a fault path. And that tells the flow what to do in case there's a failure. Now, in my scenario, what I want to do is I want to create a platform event. So I'm going to say publish error logger platform event. We're going to select our error logger. And there's only two fields that I created to populate. And the first one is the error message. So I'm going to go to my flow variable and get the fault message. And the process name, I'm just going to call this create account flow. I'm hard coding it in this case. Now we looked at the platform event, and I know I'm almost at time, so I'm going to try and kind of rush through this. I also created an object called error log, and that has information about like the error log name, which is an auto number, the error message, the process name, and the running user. So what we also looked at this platform event that has the error message and the process name being passed to it when I publish. And finally, I created another flow called error logger event create error log record. And all this does is it listens to an error logger event, and then it creates a record of our error log. And it maps the error message to the one that was published, the process name to the one that was published, and the running user to the user that created the platform event. Pretty straightforward. Let's make sure it's active. And if I go back to my platform event and refresh it now, we'll see we have a subscription. Our flow is a subscriber of this platform event. So going back to here, trying to do exactly the same thing. Ohad's second test account. I'm going to call it again Ohad. Now, normally you also, if there's a fault, you also want to give some kind of indication to your user. I would add a screen to say there was an error, the error was logged or something like this, right? In this case, we just published. So it will look like the flow completed, even though there was an error. Oh, interesting. What did I forget to do? Okay, I am getting the error, but it's not. Oh, you know what I didn't do? I did not activate the version with default path. That will do it. I can't tell you how many times I've told the customer I solved the problem and they tried and it didn't work because I forgot to click activate.
You're
Okay,
not really a Salesforce admin until you've done that a couple times.
exactly. Okay, so it looks like it completed, and that's because even though there was a failure, the flow knew what to do, and let's go here. Now, normally I would also add a screen here that says, you know, error screen, and it would say something like, you know, error text, and it would say something like, you know, some error, blah, blah, blah. And I can even include the flow error fault path here as well. However, what I wanted to show you is that if we look at our platform event again, and you'll notice that the last publish ID was not available. If I refresh this now, you'll see that, well, this is, oh, the last process ID, sorry, this is what I was looking for, now has an ID. That means there was an event that this subscriber already processed. So let's go to our error log object. And guess what? There's a record that was created here, and it has, the process name was create account flow, and here's the error message that came back to the flow. Now, why is this useful? Now you have a platform event that you can fire to from any number of flows to record errors in an error logging object, right? And it's really easy to publish an event. You could even arguably make this a subflow so that you can just pass in some variables to a subflow if you want. But you know, this wasn't very difficult to know what needs to be populated based on these two name of fields. But I can put this on any fault path on any flow, and I have one place, and now I can start to create reports. I can create, you know, custom notifications of this object. If I need to notify for a specific flow to a specific set of people, you can obviously have things like department or something else that's really more meaningful here. But again, the idea was that we broke context to do this. Now, you may ask me, why did you need to break context? Why didn't you just create the error log right here? And in reality, there's a bunch of different reasons to do it that I don't have time to get into. What I will say is creating that error log takes a DML, and publishing an event doesn't take a DML. And so you could have saved the DML here. Also, there may be other reasons that you want to separate the creation of the event, of the error, outside of the process that started it. And by creating an event, a platform event, that means that a bunch of different separate processes can publish to that event, and you can just then update this flow whenever you need, right? So you separate the creation of the log error record from the event, from the activity of publishing the event itself. And that gives you the flexibility to separate, because logging the event itself should not be something that depends on changes to that event. So in other words, if I ended up adding some more fields, I don't necessarily have to change all of my flows that publish to the event. Okay, I know we are out of time. What questions are there, Michelle?
Well, we have one more that came in. So going back to external IDs, if you were importing contacts and matching them to their account, is it better to match by external ID than by account name? Because there could, in fact, be multiple accounts with the same name, or are there any other reasons as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. You can match by account name. In fact, with Salesforce Data Loader, you can't match by account name unless you export and all that and do the lookups. But with other tools, you can. Salesforce Inspector is one that I was going to talk about if I had time. But there's many other data load tools that allow you to match by record name. I think the point you made is very valid, right? You could easily have more than one account with the same name, and that would be a problem.
Yep, I think dataloader.io gives you the ability to actually do kind of lookups
Yep,
on a specific field, but for old school data loader, which you have here and I miss dearly,
I
making sure
don't.
that that field is unique is definitely important.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but I think that might be all of the questions that we have here. I'll do a quick refresh on the Trailblazer community to make sure we don't have any there, but that platform event stuff is off the hook. Wish I'd known about that because that's phenomenal for error handling. I'm totally gonna steal it if that's
Yeah,
okay.
again, there's many other reasons why you might want to use this. Is just showing a pattern, really, that it doesn't even have to be a fault path, right? There's other scenarios in my world where we have transactions that are really heavy on processing, and we want to kick off something that's completely separate. And we can't do that because we're out of governor limits or other reasons, and we can just publish an event even in the main path and have that event continue doing some unrelated processing.
Perfect. All right, so I did a quick refresh on the community and we're good. So we've got another question. Um, so Phil asks, using the fault path helps to identify the problem area, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. And Ellie said, if you
You
have a
could
good article or video on Salesforce Inspector, can we share that with the attendees?
So I will answer the first question. You could, in theory, even have logic in a fault path that identifies. You can kind of read the error message, see what it does, and you can even recuperate or recover from it in theory. In Flow, it's not that simple. In code, a little bit easier. But yeah, I mean, at the very least, you want to have a fault path, I'm sorry, that shows an error message to the user instead of that dreaded, your flow failed, contact your admin, right? In many cases, without this, the user just don't know what went wrong. And sometimes it's something really simple, like a field is missing or a duplicate record and something like that. I don't have anything to share about Salesforce Inspector. I have not done a talk. I probably mentioned it in some of my previous talks. I'm trying to think. But highly, highly recommend the tool. Makes it easy for you to do data loads, imports, and exports really, really easily. You can access records if you're like an admin and you want to update or look at fields, even if they're not on the screen, you can show all data and you see every field on here. You can also see every relationship that every object that looks up to an account is in the relationship section. There's so much more to talk about, but I know we're out of time. So I don't have anything to share. I would just say download it and start playing with it. And maybe, who knows, maybe my next talk will be about Salesforce Inspector and some other tools.
Phenomenal. All right, we'll do one last call for questions, and I did share out the Chrome extension website
Thank you.
for Salesforce Inspector, so you can grab that out of chat as well. All right, Ohad, I think we've gotten all the questions answered. So we
Wonderful.
very
Well, I
much
hope
appreciate
you
you
learned
being
at
here.
least something new today. If you knew everything but one, I still feel like I've accomplished my goal here today. So again, thank you, Michelle, for the time. And I wish you all a good weekend and Merry Christmas if you celebrate, and Happy New Year.
Yes, thanks all for joining. Ohad, thank you again for presenting, and we will see you back bright and early in 2022.
Wonderful. Bye.